Council are present. We have no presentations to make. That is, Council has no presentations to make. Review of addendum and approval of agenda.
Moved by Councilor Ruddy, second by Councilor Morrison-Smith. Resolved that the agenda for Brady meeting of Council scheduled for Tuesday, August 9th, 2011 be approved as amended.
Any changes? Discussion? All in favor? Carried. Announcements and giving of notice. There's a schedule of meetings there. The Police Services Board meeting is still up in the air. We may not have enough members on the 25th, so if there's a change on that, we will advise. Are there any changes on that agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to number 5. Yes?
Mayor's Group, has there been a location?
The Mayor's Group meeting will be...
The 7th of September, but
Location
I think it's supposed to be waiting to confirm that.
All right, we'll confirm that. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest in the general nature thereof? Being none, we'll move on to our consent agenda. Resolution.
Moved by Councilor Morrison-Smith, second by Councilor Ruddy. Resolved that the items listed under the consent agenda, items 6.2 to 6.5, be approved as recommended.
Any discussion? All in favor? The motion carried. And we are down to delegations. We're pleased to welcome Northwatch to give us a brief presentation on their views on the nuclear waste management proposal. And we will move down there because I believe you have a PowerPoint presentation. Very good.
Pardon my manners. This is Renee Boyd from Northwatch, and she was making the presentation. And thank you very much for the attention. Done the IT bit.
I'm not going to the background.
So, thank you very much, Your Worship, and members of Council, for the invitation to come this evening and make this brief presentation. And I really welcome the opportunity. We had a great community session here in Wawa a few weeks ago, and it's really a wonderful opportunity to come back and speak to members of Council again this evening. My name is Brene Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch. And Northwatch is a regional group based in northeastern Ontario, and we're a generalist organization. So we work on a range of environmental and social issues, mostly related to natural resource management, energy conservation in the Northeast. And we've been around since 1988, and we were founded in 1988. And one of the motivations for moving from a couple of networks of environmental, social justice, development organizations at that time to a coalition was the impending federal environmental assessment of a proposal for nuclear waste burial. It was Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's geological disposal concept. So really, the discussion of nuclear waste and its long-term management has been part of Northwatch's set of priorities or primary interests since we were created in the late 80s, and many of our founding organizations have been very active in the discussion of nuclear waste and its long-term management prior to that, and we'll touch on a couple of those activities or some of those periods as we go through the presentation. So I usually take an hour to make this presentation, and I struggle to not turn it into 2 hours because there's a lot of material, there's a lot of detail. What I really want to do is share with you our understanding that's been developed in a couple of decades of participating in this discussion in a series of different venues, forums, and then set the stage for future conversations. There's a conversation happening in your community, in the community of Wawa. There's a conversation happening more broadly across northeastern Ontario and across Canada. So really, this evening I see as an opportunity to introduce ourselves to each other and for me to provide an overview of what Northwatch has identified as some of the key areas of for information sharing, and so we have a common understanding as we go forward. So we want to talk very briefly about nuclear waste, what it is, why it's a problem, managing nuclear waste, what are the options, but we're going to particularly focus on that option that's being brought forward by the nuclear industry at this time. The adaptive phase management has been presented to you by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and talk a little bit about the NWMO, Nuclear Waste Management Organization's siting process. So all of that as a sort of a backdrop or setting the context for an ongoing conversation. So what is nuclear waste? Well, there's a whole bunch of different forms or kinds or varieties of nuclear waste. So I want to take a couple of slides just to set a context a little more broadly than just the discussion of nuclear fuel waste, what's called high-level waste. So nuclear waste are all of those waste products produced along the nuclear chain, what the industry sometimes refers to as the nuclear cycle, but I think that's a bit of a misnomer because it suggests that it loops back, and it doesn't actually loop back. We start from uranium mining and go to either weapons or waste from the civilian power program. But there are a number of different kinds of waste that are generated along that chain. And more broadly speaking, nuclear waste are all of those materials, those radioactive byproducts of everything from uranium mining to milling to fusion and fission. They're all of those different kinds of waste. So we have that entire nuclear chain minus the weapons component in Canada, here in Canada, from uranium mines right through to the fuel fabrication and a nuclear power program. We also export a large volume of uranium from Canada, so in that way may also be contributing to the weapons program as well. There's not a country in the world that their uranium goes to the weapons program. So we here in Canada are host to the entire chain, and here in northeastern Ontario we're host to a couple of important steps in that chain. So right now all the uranium mining happens in northern Saskatchewan, but we did have uranium mining in Elliott Lake in the Serpent River Basin from the mid-50s to the mid-90s, and we have 200 million tons of radioactive tailings in the Serpent River Basin as a result of the mining and milling that happened in the Elliott Lake area. At present, all of the mining happens in northern Saskatchewan, and the milling happens at a couple of those mines. There's some poolings, as there was in the Elliott Lake Basin. There's some sharing of mills between mines, but in effect all of the milling happens relatively close to the mines. Then the uranium, as it comes out of the mill, is trucked. The yellow cake is trucked from northern Saskatchewan to Blind River. Blind River is the largest uranium refinery in the world. So the waste that we have at the mine and the mill are things like, primarily it's waste rock and mine tailings. And those mine tailings also have to be managed into perpetuity. They're also radioactive. In the case of the Elliott Lake tailings, they're also acid generating, which produces some additional challenges. We come along the nuclear chain and we have the uranium refinery in Blind River, which is the largest uranium refinery in the world. And it's operated by Cameco, who also operate a number of the mines and are also part owner of Bruce Power, the reactor near Garden. So we have the uranium refinery in Blind River. The waste from the uranium refinery in Blind River, there's graphite is one of the wastes, which used to be co-disposed with the tailings in Elliott Lake, and now I understand it's being returned back to Saskatchewan. But the concerns we have with some of the waste or the byproducts from the uranium refinery in Blind River are more fugitive waste. So it's what goes up the stack and then to the soil. And we see some evidence of higher levels of uranium in soil and plants. And so we have a radioactive concern with many of the waste, but we also have a toxicity issue with some of the waste. So in the case of the Blind River uranium emissions, the concern is more around the toxicity of that uranium. Then we move down to the Port Hope conversion facility, also operated by Cameco, where the uranium goes through the last stage of processing before being turned into fuel pellets and then into fuel bundles at facilities operated by General Electric in Toronto and Peterborough. Then it goes from there, the fuel has been fabricated, it goes to the reactors, and from the reactors, which we have operating, we have stations in Kincardine, near Kincardine in Bruce County, near the Bruce Peninsula on Lake Huron, and then we have 2 large stations in southern Ontario at Pickering and at Bruce. From those reactor stations, we have low-level waste, intermediate level waste, and high-level waste. The low and intermediate level goes to Bruce nuclear generating station for treatment and storage, and the high-level waste currently is stored at all of the reactor sites. And it comes after 18 months in the reactor itself, it's removed, it goes to the cooling pools, and then to dry storage or interim storage. So that's the chain. And at each step along the way, we have waste produced, and we have concerns about radioactivity, levels of exposure and dose, and so on. Nuclear fuel waste is what's called high-level waste, and that's the waste from the nuclear power reactors. So the waste system in Canada, we have the way the waste is categorized or classified in Canada is low, intermediate, and high. And it's generally classified around the level of shielding or the level of protection you need between a person and the waste to protect them from the radioactivity. That's generally how it's classified, except that in the intermediate level waste, you also have some highly radioactive waste, but they're still classified as intermediate level waste because under the Canadian system, if we call it high level waste, it means we're talking about the nuclear fuel waste, the fuel rods, the fuel bundles that have been removed from the reactor. So nuclear fuel waste is really what we're going to talk about for most of this evening. And because nuclear fuel waste is the waste that is the subject of the proposal that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has brought to the federal government and was charged by federal legislation to develop a proposal and bring to the federal government. Adaptive phase management is what they call the proposal that they brought forward. But their mandate is the nuclear fuel waste from the reactors. And that is the byproduct of nuclear power generation. So it's high-level waste. The way it becomes high-level waste. It moves from uranium, which would generally be considered to have a low level of radioactivity. It becomes high-level waste because of what happens in the reactor core. So in the reactor core, we have something that's called the fission process. And the fission process that's what makes a nuclear bomb. That's what causes the explosion. That's what generates all of the energy in a nuclear reactor. So what happens is that uranium atom is bombarded by neutrons, and that starts a chain reaction. That's the fission process. And it's during that fissioning, that process, that large volumes of energy are created and are released, and that creates the heat that is captured for the electricity generation. But it also, in the process of that fission process taking place, it creates 250 different waste products. So we have, those are the fission products. So we have 250 different, mostly radioactive isotopes as a result of this nuclear chain reaction. And it's these fission processes which are particularly challenging to deal with because they have high level, many of them, they're varied. There's 250 of them, approximately, according to Atomic Energy of Canada Limited's description. And each of them have their own trajectory. They each have their own decay chain, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But many of them are highly radioactive. Most of them, all of them are radioactive. Many of them are highly radioactive, and many of them have very, very, very long lives, what's called a decay period or a half-life. So there we've moved from having uranium. So this bundle, this is the fuel bundle that's generated when I say there's fuel fabrication facilities in Toronto and Peterborough, they've taken the uranium product from the conversion facility in Port Hope, and it's been made into pellets, and these tubes are each filled with the pellets, and then they're grouped together to form the fuel bundle. And that fuel bundle in a basket goes into the reactor. And that fission process in the reactor generates a huge amount of heat, a huge amount in the fission process, a huge amount of energy is given off. And that heat then boils water, creates steam, turns the turbine, gives us electricity. So that, in effect, what a nuclear reactor does is it creates large volumes of heat to boil water, to create steam, to turn the turbine, to generate electricity. But what we have, after having that electricity generated, so we have a definite social benefit from the electricity. But then what we have is a lasting legacy of the high-level nuclear fuel waste. So that nuclear fuel waste, those used fuel rods, when they come out of the reactor core, are extremely radioactive, and they're very long-lived. They're so radioactive when they come out of the fuel, out of the reactor core, and they have to be taken out of the reactor core at about 18 months, when they've still got almost all of their energy is still in that fuel bundle, but it's dropped in its efficiency. So it's no longer effective or efficient fuel in the reactor. So it has to be replaced. So when it comes out of that reactor core, it has to be handled robotically. It has to be moved from the reactor core into the cooling pools. And if there was to be a human exposed to that bundle during that transfer, exposure to those fuel bundles for about 20 seconds would be lethal, because it's extremely radioactive. So it isn't that, all effort, all design intentions, the system relies on there being no exposure to those fresh fuel bundles. So they're removed robotically from the reactor core into the cooling pool. Even low doses of radiation can be harmful, or radioactive exposure to radioactivity can be harmful. And those harmful effects can include anything from cancer to immune system disorders, birth defects, other health problems. Even low levels, and we'll come back and talk about this in a little bit more detail, but even low levels, small amounts of exposure to radioactivity, whether it's from low, medium, or high-level waste products, can be harmful, can have a harmful effect. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And that, because these wastes are radioactive, because they're giving off radioactivity, because small doses of small amounts of exposure can be harmful, they have to be strictly isolated from the environment, really into perpetuity, for the longest amount of time we can imagine. So there's 250 different, basically, elements, ingredients in the waste. And you'll hear, as you continue through any conversation about waste and its management, you'll hear a term called the half-life. And the half-life, so I'm going to just touch on that because it is fairly important to the conversation. So half-life is the amount of time it takes a radioactive material to reduce itself in volume by 50%. So it's half. It reduces itself to half over that amount of time. So there are different different half-lives. Some of them are in seconds, some of them are in millions of years. So, and each of them, but the important thing to understand about it is that as it reduces itself, as it goes to that, moves to that next stage in the decay chain, so reduces itself in volume by half. It's giving off energy. So, uranium-238. Now, I've just got two examples just to show you the decay chain. So this is when it goes from one isotope or one waste element decays to half its volume. It means that it's moved down to its its progeny, or its the next step in the decay chain. And it doesn't just dissipate, it moves off to the next stage. So uranium-238 becomes thorium-234, becomes protactinium-234. And so on. It goes through each of these stages, and it moves through each of these stages. It's giving off energy. That's what radioactivity is. It's that giving off of energy as it decays. And then each of them will eventually come to a stable element. In the case of uranium-238 and uranium-235, both of them, it comes down to lead as a stable element. So each of these gives off energy. And so when we hear that, well, it's got a half-life, this has a short half-life, this has a long half-life, we need to be remembering that that doesn't mean that it's just reduced itself in volume and we've only got half the problem. What we've actually got is a different set of problems, because as uranium reduces itself, it moves to the next, to thorium, and then to protactinium, and then to actinium, and so on. And that's what is giving off the radioactivity. So even low doses of that radiation, even low amounts, small amounts of exposure to radioactivity can cause harm. And it causes harm. It harms us in different ways, different groups. We are differently affected. So women are more likely to be affected than men. Small children are more vulnerable than adults because of differences in our physiology. So women are more vulnerable because we have more fat, and fat absorbs the effect more. Children, because they're growing and the damage happens at a cellular level. So a child or a baby in utero is the most vulnerable. And it causes, and it will affect different radioactive elements will affect different parts of the human system. So the thyroid, iodine-131 is attracted to the thyroid. That's why if you live in a reactor community, when you register your child for school, you sign a release form saying that the school can administer iodine tablets, non-radioactive iodine tablets, in the case of a nuclear accident or an unplanned release, a large release from the reactor, presumably because of an accident. And that's because if you take the radioactive iodine, it's a non-radioactive iodine, your thyroid will absorb it and then will hit capacity and will not absorb the radioactive iodine, and so it will reduce the likelihood of thyroid cancer. And many of the children in the Chernobyl area have been the victims of thyroid cancer because that's a very vulnerable organ. So iodine-131 was one of the significant releases from iodine. So lungs are more vulnerable to plutonium. And the kidney is more vulnerable to ruthenium, it says here, also to uranium. So each different people are differently vulnerable, and different parts of our body are differently vulnerable, will be affected differently by different kinds of exposure. And it's not to say that every exposure is going to result in an identifiable harm. It is to say that there is an increased risk. There is no level below which there is no risk. So there was a long series of studies and discussions on that in the scientific community. And in 2005, there was a milestone report released called the BEER-7 report. And that's the biological effects of ionizing radiation. And this was the 7th in a series of studies done through the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. And what their BEER-7 report affirmed was that there is there's no linear threshold. So every amount of exposure has a corresponding increase in risk. So exposure is generally a combination of dose, time, and distance from that source of radioactivity. But what they're saying is that every exposure has a corresponding increase in risk. It doesn't, and so even low levels, even small levels, have some corresponding risk.